QNMP from Contact Report 439.
Thank you. Then I have another bulletin question here, to which I have written an answer that is to be published in Bulletin 62 next December. It's a delicate subject, on which you certainly have more information and knowledge than I do, and on which I would like to know from you whether everything I have written is correct, or whether I need to change or add anything. Maybe everything is a bit too long? If I may read you the whole thing.
47, of course.
Now first the question, then the answer.
Question yesterday evening 6.1. 07. I watched the film Schindler's List, and the question arose again what the motives of the Nazis were for wanting to destroy the Jewish citizens. Such an idea does not come from a beer mood. There must have been deeper reasons.
Answer. This question cannot be answered with a few words or sentences, because the entire circumstances of the persecution of the Jews and the murder of Jews from time immemorial, as well as the Holocaust in the Nazi Empire, require a longer explanation. The motives of the Nazis were traditional anti-Semitism and hatred against the Jews. Anti-Semitism is based on a dislike and hostility towards the Jews, and since time immemorial, there has even been hatred in play, which was extensively expressed in all possible forms against the Jewish faithful. In this respect, however, the term anti-Semitism is misleading. Leading because, as a rule, it does not refer to the community of Semitic peoples, but only to the Jewish people. Originally, the hostility and hatred against the Jews was due to their religious and social segregation in the host countries since they were scattered throughout the world, through the so-called diaspora Greek for dispersion, a term taken from Hellenistic Jewish literature to refer to a religious, denominational, and/or natural minority and the territory it inhabits. As a result of religious and social segregation, the Jewish minorities had already appeared alien before the establishment of Christianity, which often meant that Jews were only allowed to do work related to money, jewelry and trade, art and literature, etc. from this traditional hostility towards Jews, which must actually be described as anti-Judaism, and to which the persecution of the Jews in the Roman Empire and the fight against Judaism in the Middle Ages belong. It was also derived that from the 13th to the 18th century, the Jews had to wear a Judenkennzeichen, the so-called Judenabzeichen, which served to distinguish them from the rest of the population in public. It was a compulsory badge. For example, a yellow or red spot, ring or star, or the so-called Jewish hat. Also, the funnel-shaped, mostly yellow Jew's hat, which was intended for men, was a sign of Jewish affiliation. In many countries, it was worn in the Middle Ages, and after 1215 was prescribed as a Jew's badge. From the 15th century onwards, the Jew's hat was replaced by other forms of headgear. In the Nazi Empire, under National Socialist rule in the Third Reich, the Jewish hat was reintroduced mainly in the form of the Star of David. This anti-Jewishism of the old days must be distinguished from modern anti-Semitism, which was primarily directed against the emancipation of the Jews, legal and social equality since the 18th, 19th century. Basically, it was mainly politically and economically justified and used. Since the end of the 19th century, racist anti-Semitism gained increasing political influence, especially in Germany, Austria-Hungary, and also in Eastern Europe. After the end of the First World War, 1914 to 1918, anti-Semitism became an irrational obsession in the broad strata of these countries, and thus the key explanation for the political and social structural crisis. Through the unrestrained agitation of the anti-Semites, people of Jewish origin and tradition gained influence in terms of the economy, money, art, and literature, etc., which was considered corrosive by the anti-Semitic forces. The whole thing represented all forms of capitalism, liberalism, and socialism in the eyes of the anti-Semites, only as different manifestations of a targeted, parasitic, Jewish infiltration. This anti-Semitism was already violent in its attitude, and as an integral part of the National Socialist ideology of the Third Reich, Germany led to a constantly increasing persecution of Jews. The whole thing was connected with the exclusion of the Jews from public life, which ultimately led to the state provocation of pogroms, or to looting, devastation of Jewish property, and the murder of the Jews, which ultimately resulted in the final solution of the Jewish question. That is to say, the final solution of the Jewish question. That is to say, the murder of about 4.5 million Jews and about 2 million other people consisting of Gypsies or Sinti and Roma, as well as of people with mental and physical disabilities at that time, called life unfit for life and unworthy of dignity, and of criminals. The whole thing led to the so-called Holocaust, which killed around 6.5 million people in the Second World War, which claimed around 60 million lives. Even after the Second World War, anti-Semitism as a collective judgment has by no means been overcome worldwide. Since the post-war period, neo-Nazis and other right-wing extremist anti-Semitic groups have been up to their malicious mischief, with these hate monsters being particularly prevalent in the industrialized countries, especially in Germany, Switzerland, Northern Europe, and the USA. These groups destroy Jewish cemeteries, as well as other Jewish institutions, in addition to attacking, hurting, crippling, or even murdering Jewish and foreign people. They also disturb peaceful events and sow hatred all around against all people who are not their own kind. Stalinism has repeatedly and tactically exploited anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union to purge and discriminate against the opposition. And since 1989-92, there has been an alarming resurgence of party political anti-Semitism in the so-called post-communist countries. Anti-Semitism in the Anglo-Saxon countries is of a religious, economic, or socially discriminatory nature. If we look at the Middle East conflict or the Six-Day War of 1967 in the Middle East, we can see that anti-Semitism of its own ideological nature has emerged in the Islamic Arab countries, directed in a struggle of the Arabs against Zionism and the State of Israel. In recent times, however, transitions between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism have also become apparent, although the fact that the motives lead to anti-Semitic consequences, either unconsciously or for ideological reasons, must not be ignored. The term Semites is actually a term that only came into being in the 18th century, which, on the basis of the biblical Table of Nations, describes a number of peoples as having a common language, namely Semitic. This Table of Nations is a list of the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japhet, the three sons of Noah, listed in Genesis 10. It is based on the common belief in antiquity that one ancestor stands for each people. Relationships can then be explained genealogically. 71 names of peoples are mentioned in this list, which is intended to give an overview of the peoples known to biblical Israel. The peoples in the north are thus traced back to Japhet, the peoples in the west to Shem, and the peoples in the south to Ham. It is said that 26 peoples went out from Shem, among them the Elamites, Assyrians, Babylonians, and Arameans, etc. But the table of peoples is essentially geographically oriented, according to which the settlement area of the Semites extends from western Anatolia to Persia and from Armenia to the Red Sea. In terms of ethnology, the peoples mentioned do not form closed groups, so the term ethno is graphically unsuitable, and moreover, discredited by its evaluative misuse in 19th and 20th century racial theories. Anti-Semitism and racism. The term can therefore only be applied to the Semitic languages from a linguistic and limited point of view. With regard to the elimination of anti-Semitism, the international treaties and the efforts of the UNEU to guarantee human rights serve, among other things, as a basis. In addition, there are also national prohibitions on the different treatment of people on the basis of origin, race, and political opinion. Societies for Christian-Jewish cooperation strive to combat anti-Semitic prejudices at their roots, while various church studies and decisions have attempted to define the relationship between Christians and Jews theologically. Fundamental to the anti-Semitism that emanates from the Christian world and relates to the Jews, many Christians hold them responsible for the crucifixion of Emmanuel, alias Jesus Christ. For this reason alone, they have been stirring up hatred against Judaism since time immemorial, but this is absolutely nonsensical. In truth, Emmanuel was not crucified by the Jews, but through the fault of the chief priests and the Romans, who stirred up the people, after which the crucifixion was carried out by the Roman henchmen. Thus, the actual Jewish people did not contribute anything to the crucifixion, for the pro and hurricane cries of the people, which were under the suggestive influence of the high priests, were only their few, who, moreover, in no way embodied the people. So, in principle, the whole Jewish people cannot be discriminated against and pronounced guilty of the crucifixion of Emmanuel, as has been done since time immemorial, the Catholic Church bearing the main blame for this lie, for it was the Catholic Church that brought this slander of the alleged guilt of the Jews into the world. The truth is also that the Romans saw Emmanuel's teaching as revolutionary, and for this reason alone, they intended to condemn him and hand him over to crucifixion, which they did with the help of the Jewish high priests. Well, the history of the origin of the people of Israel leads far back to the Hebraeans and the ancient Hebrews who came out of them, who were not exactly saints as a whole, and who conquered Palestine out of it with evil acts of war and murder. But this is already thousands of years ago, and has nothing to do with the crucifixion of Emmanuel, which was unjust in one way or another, and which, as I said, was not to be attributed to the Jewish people, but to their high priests and the Romans. Like all true prophets, who brought the teaching of the Spirit, or the teaching of truth, or the teaching of life to the respective people, Emmanuel was also a revolutionary, who of course was not appreciated either by the Romans or by the chief priests. Emmanuel's teaching was the teaching of peace, freedom, love, and harmony, as well as the carrying of one's own responsibility, leaving out religion. This, of course, did not suit either the chief priests or the Romans in their dirty business, so that the revoluter and blasphemer they hated had to disappear from the scene, which was to happen by crucifixion. At least that was what they hoped. But they did not expect that Emmanuel was only in deep faint when he was taken down from the cross, so that he could flee to Syria and later to India. Many Jewish believers who had taken pleasure in his teaching helped him in this, and there were many of them. What is happening in Israel today with regard to the warlike and murderous machinations against the Palestinians cannot be blamed on the entire Israeli people, for it is truly only the powerful of the country and their supporters who are to blame for everything and who stir up murder and destruction. In Israel, as in all countries of the world, the reasonable part of the population wants to live in peace, love, freedom, and harmony, but is overshadowed and suppressed by the murderous and destructive and totally irresponsible elements. That is the way it is everywhere in the world. Consequently, the reasonable and peace-loving people do not get a word in edgewise, which is why evil is gaining new power again and again. But this evil is also to be found in anti-Semitism and racism, as well as in xenophobia, which are all idiocies to which only the stupid and dumb can fall prey. And these are the ones who have no idea whatsoever how and why anti-Semitism, racial hatred, and xenophobia came into being in the first place. Because all anti-Semitic, racial, and xenophobic haters clearly and undoubtedly lack the necessary intelligence to grasp and understand the origin and feeble-mindedness of these things. But understanding and reason cannot be demanded of the feeble-minded and the poor in intelligence, because their stupidity and idiocy still vegetates in the deepest depths of the stupidity of intelligence, which is peculiar to brain amputees. If Israel and its murderous, criminal war and terror machinations are to be scolded and condemned, then this does not mean, just as with the USA and other states, the entire population, but only the criminal and irresponsible rulers and their henchmen and supporters, fellow howlers and roarers, through whom murder and destruction as well as misery. Roaring misery and war are brought upon other people and nations. It is these miserable creatures, hostile to man and life, who in their political as well as religious and sectarian fanaticism and in their lust for power and self-importance bring all evil upon the world. And this is exactly what the righteous Israelis and all other upright Jews living in Jewish tradition are not doing, nor are the consistent believers in Islam, Christians, Hindus, and Buddhists, etc. For this kind of people who cultivate humanity, a lance can be taken at any time, no matter whether they are Jewish, Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, or Muslim, etc., because in truth it is they who are always striving to bring peace, freedom, love, and harmony, while all the others are only out for death, murder, destruction, ruin, and power. In the same way, this applies in both relationships to all people of all religions, sects, philosophies, and ideologies, so that no nation is exempt from this. But this clearly states that no people may be hated, denigrated, or slandered as human beings in any way and for any reason. Actions and deeds may be condemned, but they must not cause harm to human life or limb. Anti-Semitism, racial hatred, and xenophobia, however, in their abysmal evil, are based on machinations that do not honor man as such, but harass, murder, denigrate, and slander him, which is against all human rights. And this also refers to what the Nazis have done to the Jews, but also to what the neo-Nazi pack is organizing criminally against the Jews in our time. But this also applies to all other right-wing extremists who act in the same way in their racial and xenophobic hatred. The whole of humanity should finally understand that hatred, revenge, and retribution are in every respect inhuman, just as old things should not be carried into the future again and again by words, machinations, and events. Things that are past belong in the past and must never be ruminated on again, in order to make descendants guilty, because they cannot help what their ancestors did. Even what mothers and fathers or brothers and sisters have done only affects them alone, which is why their deeds should not be held against their descendants, etc. Also, things that happen in the current life and escape into the past should never be brought out again and used as an accusation that goes back. But if a person nevertheless does the same thing, that he or she becomes reproachful with old and past things, then he or she belongs to the group of brain amputees, as well as those who have succumbed to anti-Semitism, racial or xenophobia, vindictiveness, and the urge for revenge.
Billy,